92% of people who set goals this year already quit. And here is the part nobody tells you. They did not quit because they were weak. They quit because their mind was never trained to do anything else. Sit with that for a moment, because right now, you are probably carrying a story about yourself. A story that says you lack discipline, that you are not tough enough, that somewhere inside you, there is a defect, something missing, that makes you fold when things get hard. That story is a lie, and it may be the most expensive lie you ever believe, because it stops you from fixing the one thing that would actually change everything. Here is what is actually happening. The University of Pennsylvania conducted a landmark study tracking over 2,000 professionals across 8 years. They measured IQ, talent, education, opportunity, and one additional variable: the ability to sustain effort when discomfort arrived. The results disrupted decades of assumptions about human performance. The people who achieved the most were not the smartest. They were not the most talented. They were the ones whose brains had been conditioned, through specific, repeatable habits, to keep moving forward when every internal signal told them to stop. Conditioned. Not born with. Not gifted. Conditioned. Through habits. This is the first thing you need to understand, and it restructures everything you thought you knew about yourself. Mental toughness is not a personality trait. It is not something woven into your DNA at birth. It is a neurological pattern, a set of neural pathways that fire in a specific sequence when you encounter resistance. And like every neural pathway in the human brain, it can be built, it can be strengthened, and it can be made automatic through the daily habits you choose to practice. But here is where it gets unsettling. And this is the part that most books, most podcasts, most speeches about success completely fail to address. The opposite is also true. Quitting is not a character flaw. Quitting is a trained reflex. Every time you hit the snooze button, every time you skip the workout, every time you tell yourself, "I will start Monday," your brain is not being lazy. Your brain is rehearsing. It is running a neurological drill of withdrawal. And the more you rehearse that drill, the faster and more effortless it becomes. You are not failing to build discipline. You are building the wrong discipline. You are becoming an expert at stopping. Stanford University's neuroscience department published a study in the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience that confirmed something remarkable. When a person repeatedly avoids discomfort, the brain constructs what researchers call a default escape pathway. It becomes the route of least neurological resistance, the channel your brain selects before your conscious mind even has time to weigh in. Imagine a river carving through limestone. The first pass barely scratches the surface, but after 1,000 repetitions, the water has cut a canyon so deep that redirecting the flow would take extraordinary, deliberate effort. That is what years of micro-surrenders do to your neural architecture. Your brain does not ask you whether you want to quit. It quits for you, automatically, and then presents you with a rationalization afterward. "I was tired. The timing was not right. I will try again next month." Now consider what that means. Every time you told yourself, "I am just not a disciplined person," you were misdiagnosing the problem entirely. You were not undisciplined. You were extraordinarily disciplined at quitting. Your brain had been trained, across years, across thousands of invisible micro-decisions, to default to the exit. And nobody explained this to you. Nobody told you that the problem was never your character. The problem was your habits. The daily, automatic, unconscious habits that had been programming your brain's response to difficulty without your permission. This is the turning point, not just for this chapter, but for the way you understand yourself. Because if quitting is a trained reflex, then not quitting is also a trained reflex. If your brain can carve a canyon for surrender, it can carve an equally deep channel for persistence. The neuroscience is identical. The mechanism does not change. The only variable is which set of habits you reinforce, the ones that rehearse retreat or the ones that rehearse resolve. And this is precisely where the average mind and the trained mind diverge into two completely different lives. The average mind treats every moment of discomfort as a signal to stop. It encounters resistance, and it interprets that sensation as evidence that something is wrong. This is too hard. I am not ready. Maybe this is not meant for me. The average mind genuinely believes that successful people do not experience this friction, that somehow the people at the top operate in a state of effortless flow, unbothered by the weight that crushes everyone else. The trained mind knows the truth. Discomfort is not a warning. It is a threshold. It is the precise neurological boundary where adaptation begins. Every elite performer, every Olympic athlete, every surgeon who has spent 14 hours in an operating room, every founder who built something from nothing, feels the exact same resistance you feel, the same fatigue, the same whisper to quit. The difference is not what they feel. The difference is what happens next. And what happens next is determined entirely by which habits have been installed in their nervous system. A trained mind encounters the pull to quit and responds with a practiced behavior. An untrained mind encounters the same pull and responds with a feeling. And feelings, left in charge of your decisions, will choose comfort over growth every single time. McKinsey's Global Leadership Institute analyzed the performance data of over 4,000 executives across 37 countries. They were looking for the variable that separated the top 8% from everyone else. It was not education. It was not intelligence. It was not even experience. It was this: consistent daily habits executed regardless of emotional state. Not when they felt inspired. Not when conditions were ideal. Not when someone was holding them accountable. Every single day, whether they wanted to or not, the habits ran. That phrase, regardless of emotional state, is the central axis of everything you will learn in this book. Because here is the most damaging misconception the entire self-help industry has ever normalized. They told you that you need motivation. They told you to find your deeper purpose, to visualize your ideal future, and that the emotional fuel from that vision would carry you through the hard days. And motivation does work, for roughly 72 hours. Then the neurochemistry fades, the dopamine drops, the excitement dissolves into the background noise of real life. And you find yourself exactly where you started, not because you are broken, but because you built your entire system on a resource that was never designed to last. Motivation is a chemical event in your brain. It spikes and it crashes. Building a life of mental toughness on motivation is like building a house on a foundation that appears and disappears based on the weather. The structure has no chance. What actually sustains the people who never quit is not an emotion. It is an identity, reinforced by habits so deeply embedded that they operate below the level of conscious choice. An identity that says, I am the kind of person who does not stop, and then proves it daily through small, non-negotiable actions that compound into something unbreakable. This is not a book about getting inspired. This is not a listening experience designed to make you feel powerful for a weekend before the feeling evaporates. This is a mental conditioning system. Over the next 9 chapters, you will learn 6 specific frameworks, each one engineered to dismantle a different component of the quitting reflex and replace it with an automatic persistence response, built from habits you can install starting today. You will learn why your very first decision each morning predicts whether you will quit or push through that day. You will discover why telling people about your goals is neurologically destroying your ability to achieve them. You will understand why pressure, the thing you have spent your entire life avoiding, is the single most powerful raw material for building an unbreakable mind. And you will construct, chapter by chapter, a daily system of habits that makes quitting feel fundamentally incompatible with who you are. But understand something clearly before we go further. Nothing in this book works if you treat it as information. Information without execution is just intellectual decoration. And you did not come here for decoration. You came here because something in you recognizes the gap between who you are and who you are capable of becoming. Something in you is finished with the cycle of starting and stopping. Finished with knowing what to do, but never sustaining it long enough to see the return. That part of you, the part that chose this audiobook, the part that is still listening right now instead of moving on to the next distraction, that is not weakness searching for a crutch. That is an undeveloped strength waiting for the right system. And the system starts with a test. A simple, unavoidable, 7-second test that happens every single morning of your life. It requires no equipment, no preparation, and no willpower. But it predicts, with uncomfortable accuracy, whether you are building the habits of someone who never quits, or running the same quitting software you have been running for years. That test is waiting for you in the next chapter. Chapter 2. The Snooze Button Test. Every morning, in the first 7 seconds after your alarm rings, your brain makes a decision that predicts your entire day. Not influences it, predicts it. And you have been making that decision on autopilot for so long that you probably do not even recognize it as a decision anymore. Here is what happens at the neurological level. The moment your alarm sounds, your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for discipline, planning, and long-term thinking, is at its weakest point of the entire 24-hour cycle. It has just emerged from sleep. It is groggy, underpowered, barely online. Meanwhile, your limbic system, the ancient, emotional, comfort-seeking part of your brain, is fully operational. It has been running all night, and it has one message, delivered with absolute neurological authority: stay in bed. This is not laziness. This is architecture. Your brain is structurally designed so that, in that 7-second window, the part of you that wants comfort has a massive advantage over the part of you that wants progress. The limbic system fires faster, feels louder, and carries more emotional weight than the prefrontal cortex can generate in its half-awake state. It is not a fair fight, and it was never supposed to be. So what happens when you hit snooze? The University of California, Berkeley's Sleep and Neuroimaging Laboratory published research showing that the act of hitting snooze does not simply delay your morning. It sends a specific instruction to your entire nervous system. That instruction is, when discomfort arrives, retreat. When the hard thing presents itself, choose the soft option. When the moment demands action, negotiate for delay. And your brain logs that instruction not as a small, meaningless morning habit, but as a foundational operating principle for the hours that follow. This is what most people never grasp. The snooze button is not about sleep. It is about the very first negotiation you have with yourself each day. And the outcome of that negotiation echoes through every decision you make until you close your eyes again at night. Think about what is actually happening in those 7 seconds. You set the alarm the night before. That was a promise, a contract between your present self and your future self. Your present self said, "Tomorrow, I will get up at 6. That is a commitment. That is your identity speaking. And then the alarm sounds, and within 7 seconds, you break the contract. You override the person you said you would be, not because the situation changed, not because an emergency occurred, but because it felt uncomfortable. And this is the mechanism that governs far more of your life than you realize. Because the snooze button is not really about the snooze button. It is a diagnostic tool. It reveals, with brutal clarity, your brain's default response to the gap between what you committed to and what you feel like doing in the moment. That gap, between intention and sensation, is the exact space where mental toughness either lives or dies. And every morning, you are training your brain's response to it. You are either rehearsing the habit of honoring your word to yourself, or rehearsing the habit of abandoning it the moment comfort calls. There is no neutral position. The rehearsal happens whether you are conscious of it or not. Now here is where this becomes deeply uncomfortable and deeply useful. A research team at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences in Germany conducted a study on decision fatigue and self-regulatory patterns. They found that subjects who compromised on their very first commitment of the day were 400% more likely to compromise on subsequent commitments throughout the same day. 400%. Not 10, not 20, 400. The researchers described it as a permission cascade. Once the brain grants itself one exception, the threshold for granting the next exception drops dramatically. Each compromise lubricates the next one. Each small retreat makes the next retreat feel more reasonable, more justified, more automatic. So when you hit snooze, you are not just losing 9 minutes of sleep. You are lowering the barrier for every act of self-betrayal that follows. The skipped workout, the junk food at lunch, the important task you push to tomorrow, the difficult conversation you avoid. None of these feel connected to a snooze button, but neurologically, they are running on the same permission you granted yourself at 6 in the morning. The average person treats these as isolated failures, separate problems with separate causes. They think the skipped workout is about fitness motivation. They think the procrastination is about time management. They think the avoided conversation is about confidence. They never see the thread that connects all of it, a single, daily habit of breaking promises to themselves, practiced so consistently that it has become invisible. The trained mind sees it differently. The trained mind understands that integrity with yourself is not a concept. It is a practice. It is the foundational habit upon which every other habit depends. And it begins, literally, neurologically, measurably, in those 7 seconds after the alarm. So what does the trained mind actually do? It does not rely on willpower. Willpower, as a resource, is at its lowest point in that exact moment. Expecting willpower to save you at 6 in the morning is like expecting an empty fuel tank to get you across the desert. The trained mind uses something far more reliable. It uses a pre-committed response. Here is the protocol, and it is deceptively simple. The night before, you do not just set an alarm. You make a specific, non-negotiable decision about what your body will do the moment that alarm sounds. Not what you will think about, not what you will consider, what your body will physically do. Feet on the floor, standing position. That is the entire commitment. Not a morning routine, not a 5-mile run, not a cold shower. Feet on the floor. This works because of a principle that neuroscientists at MIT's Habit Research Lab have documented extensively. When a habit is reduced to its smallest possible physical action, the prefrontal cortex does not need to be fully engaged to execute it. The action can be triggered by the cue, the alarm sound, and carried out almost mechanically before the limbic system has time to mount its full counterargument. You are not fighting the urge to stay in bed. You are moving before the urge has time to organize itself. And here is the part that matters most. When your feet hit the floor, your brain registers a completed commitment, a promise kept, an identity confirmed. You said you would get up, and you got up. That micro-event sends a signal through your entire neurological system that recalibrates the day. The permission cascade now works in your favor. You kept one promise, so keeping the next one feels more natural. And the next, and the next. You are not building willpower. You are building a habit of self-trust. And self-trust, compounded daily, is the raw material of an unbreakable identity. This is what separates the person who quits from the person who does not. It is not some grand, dramatic moment of heroic resolve. It is not a motivational speech playing in their head. It is the accumulation of hundreds of mornings where they honored a 7-second contract with themselves, where they chose the hard action before their brain could offer the easy alternative, where they trained, through repetition, through habit, a nervous system that defaults to forward motion instead of retreat. Now I want you to consider something. If you have been hitting snooze for the past 5 years, every weekday, roughly 260 days per year, that is 1,300 rehearsals of breaking a promise to yourself. 1,300 times your brain practiced the sequence: commitment, discomfort, retreat. 1,300 deposits into the neural account of quitting. That is not a discipline problem. That is an engineering problem. And engineering problems have engineering solutions. The solution is not to become a different person. The solution is to install a different habit at the most leveraged moment of your day. 7 seconds. Feet on the floor. Promise kept. Identity reinforced. It sounds almost too simple. And that is precisely why it works. Because the habits that reshape your identity are never dramatic. They are small, boring, repeatable, and so easy to dismiss that most people never bother. Most people are waiting for the big transformation, the breakthrough moment, the morning they wake up and suddenly feel like a different person. That morning does not come. What comes instead is a slow, quiet accumulation of kept promises that, over weeks and months, rebuilds the foundation of who you believe yourself to be. Not who you hope to be, not who you perform as in public, who you actually are, alone, at 6 in the morning, when nobody is watching and nobody would ever know the difference. You now have the test. You understand the neuroscience behind it. You understand why it matters far beyond the morning. But here is what the snooze button test cannot do by itself. It can start the engine. It can give you that first daily deposit of self-trust. But sustaining it, making it permanent, making it part of who you are at a level so deep that quitting becomes unrecognizable to your own nervous system, that requires something the snooze button test only hints at. It requires a fundamental shift in how you relate to your own identity. Not your goals, not your ambitions, your identity. Because most people try to change their behavior while leaving their identity untouched. And that is like trying to change the direction of a river by rearranging the rocks on the surface while the current underneath keeps flowing the same way it always has. What that shift looks like, how it works, and why it is the single most important upgrade you will ever make to your mental operating system. That is what the next chapter is built around. Chapter 3: Identity over Mood. A 2012 study at the University of Pennsylvania tracked 1,500 professionals for 8 years. The researchers were not interested in productivity hacks or morning routines. They were investigating a single question: why do some people sustain high performance across years while others surge and collapse in predictable cycles? The answer had nothing to do with motivation, nothing to do with talent, nothing to do with how badly they wanted it. The people who sustained were operating from a completely different internal reference point. They were not managing their behavior. They were managing their identity. And that distinction, the gap between changing what you do and changing who you are, is the most underestimated variable in the entire landscape of human performance. Here is what most people attempt when they decide to build mental toughness. They set a goal. They create a plan. They summon motivation. And then they try to force their behavior to match the plan day after day through sheer effort. On good days, when energy is high and the mood cooperates, they execute beautifully. On hard days, when they feel drained or uncertain or overwhelmed, the plan collapses. And they interpret that collapse as evidence of personal failure. They think something is wrong with them. They think they need more discipline, more willpower, more motivation. They are solving the wrong problem. Because what they are really doing is trying to run new software on an old operating system. The behaviors are new, but the identity underneath, the deep, reflexive sense of who they are, has not changed. And when behavior conflicts with identity, identity wins. Every time, without exception. This is not opinion. This is one of the most well-documented principles in behavioral psychology. Stanford psychologist Carol Dweck spent 3 decades studying how self-concept shapes performance. Her research, published across multiple peer-reviewed journals, demonstrated that people do not act according to their goals. They act according to the type of person they believe themselves to be. A person who identifies as someone who is trying to get disciplined will behave very differently from a person who identifies as someone who does not quit. The first identity contains a built-in escape clause. It allows for failure because the effort itself is positioned as the achievement. The second identity has no exit door. Quitting is not one of the available options because it would require them to become someone they are not. This is not semantics. This is the difference between a system that depends on conditions and a system that operates regardless of conditions. Let me make this concrete. Consider 2 people facing the same situation. It is 6:30 in the evening. They are exhausted from a full day of work. They committed to a 30-minute workout. Their body feels heavy. Their mind is generating a dozen plausible reasons to skip. Person A thinks, I should work out, but I really don't feel like it today. I'll go tomorrow when I have more energy. This person is making a mood-based decision. Their behavior is governed by their current emotional state. The mood says stop, so they stop, and they feel a small, immediate relief, followed by a slow, familiar erosion of self-respect that they will try not to think about for the rest of the night. Person B thinks, I don't feel like it. That's irrelevant. I am someone who trains. This person is making an identity-based decision. The mood is identical. The fatigue is identical. But the internal reference point is completely different. They are not asking, do I feel like doing this? They are asking, is this who I am? And because the answer is yes, the behavior follows, not with enthusiasm, not with excitement, but with the quiet, unremarkable consistency that separates people who transform from people who merely try. Notice what did not happen. Person B did not use willpower to overpower the feeling. They did not give themselves a motivational speech. They did not watch an inspirational video to generate enough emotional fuel to get off the couch. They simply consulted a different authority. Instead of asking their mood for permission, they asked their identity for instructions. This is the identity over mood framework. And once you understand it, you will see it operating everywhere. In every decision you make, in every moment of resistance, in every gap between what you planned and what you actually do. The Journal of Personality and Social Psychology published a study in 2014 examining how identity-based habits outperform goal-based habits over extended periods. Participants who framed their habits as expressions of identity, I am a reader instead of I want to read more, maintained their behavior at a rate 67% higher over a 12-month period compared to the goal-based group. 67%. Same behavior, same difficulty level, same external conditions. The only variable was the internal frame. One group was performing a task. The other group was confirming who they were. This is the mechanism that makes habits permanent instead of temporary. When a habit is attached to a goal, it lasts only as long as the goal feels relevant. When a habit is attached to an identity, it lasts as long as the identity holds. An identity, unlike motivation, does not fluctuate with your sleep quality or your stress level or whether you had a good day at work. Identity is structural. It sits beneath the weather of your emotions like bedrock sits beneath the surface of shifting soil. But here's the question that matters. How do you actually build an identity? How do you go from, I want to be someone who doesn't quit, to genuinely being that person? Not as an aspiration, but as a neurological fact. The answer is not what the self-help industry typically suggests. They will tell you to write affirmations, repeat empowering statements in the mirror, visualize the person you want to become. And while there is limited evidence that visualization can support performance in narrow contexts, the neuroscience of identity formation tells a very different story. Research from the Cognitive Neuroscience Lab at University College London, published in 2018, showed that identity is not constructed by what you say about yourself. It is constructed by what you repeatedly do. Every action you take is a vote for the type of person you are becoming. Skip the workout, and you cast a vote for someone who skips. Show up despite exhaustion, and you cast a vote for someone who shows up. Over time, the votes accumulate, and the identity that emerges is simply the one that received the most votes. This is why habits are not just behavioral tools. Habits are identity architecture. Each one is a brick in the structure of who you are, and the structure does not care about your intentions. It only counts the bricks you actually lay. So the question is never, what habits should I build? The question is, who do I want to become, and which habits would that person practice? When you reverse engineer from identity instead of forward engineering from goals, something fundamental shifts in the way you approach difficulty. Goals create a binary. You are either succeeding or failing. Identity creates a spectrum. You are either reinforcing who you are or contradicting it. And contradiction feels different from failure. Failure feels like evidence that you are not good enough. Contradiction feels like betrayal of someone you already are. That distinction is not philosophical. It is functional. It changes the emotional cost of quitting. A person trying to reach a goal who misses a day thinks, I fell behind. Maybe I can't do this. A person building an identity who misses a day thinks, that was not me. I need to correct course immediately. The first response opens a door to quitting. The second response closes it. Harvard psychologist Dr. Ellen Langer's research on mindful self-concept, spanning nearly 4 decades, confirms that the stories we tell ourselves about who we are operate as self-fulfilling neurological instructions. When you consistently act as the person you are becoming, not waiting until you feel like that person, but acting first and letting the feeling follow, your brain begins to reorganize its prediction models. It starts anticipating the disciplined response instead of the avoidant one. It starts treating persistence as the default, not the exception. And over time, what once required conscious effort becomes automatic. Not because you became superhuman, because your habits voted, day after day, for a specific version of you. and your brain eventually stopped questioning the results. This is what identity over mood actually means in practice. It does not mean ignoring your emotions. It does not mean suppressing how you feel. It means recognizing that your emotions are data, not directives. They tell you something about your current state. They do not tell you who you are. And when you learn to let identity lead and mood follow, you step into a completely different operating system, one where consistency is no longer an act of heroism, but an expression of self. You now understand the trained mind's first two layers. The snooze button test builds daily self-trust. Identity over mood ensures that self-trust is anchored to something deeper than fleeting emotion. But there is a vulnerability in this system that most people never see coming. Even the strongest identity requires evidence. It requires daily proof that the person you claim to be is the person you actually are. And the way most people try to generate that proof is exactly backwards. They chase massive wins. They set ambitious milestones. They believe that identity is confirmed by achievement. It is not. Identity is confirmed by accumulation. And the science behind how tiny, almost invisible progress compounds into permanent transformation is so counterintuitive that it explains why 90% of people build their habits wrong from the very start. That science, and the framework that applies it, is what the next chapter delivers. Chapter 4: The Progress Principle. Harvard Business School analyzed 12,000 daily journal entries from 238 professionals across 7 companies over the course of 4 months. They were searching for the single most powerful driver of sustained high performance. Not what makes people productive on a good day, what keeps them engaged, resilient, and mentally present across weeks and months without burning out. The answer was not money. It was not recognition. It was not passion, talent, or even leadership quality. It was something so small that most of the participants did not even notice it happening. It was micro-progress, tiny, incremental, almost invisible forward movement on meaningful work. The researchers, led by Dr. Teresa Amabile, called it the progress principle, and the data was unambiguous. On days when people made even the smallest step forward, not a breakthrough, not a milestone, not a celebration-worthy achievement, but a modest, quiet advance, their motivation, emotional state, and cognitive performance were measurably higher. On days when they felt stuck, even if nothing objectively bad happened, the opposite occurred. Motivation dropped. Frustration increased. The desire to quit intensified. And here is the part that should fundamentally change how you approach your goals. The size of the progress did not matter. A small win produced nearly the same psychological effect as a large one. Your brain does not distinguish between finishing a major project and completing a single meaningful task within that project. It registers forward motion. That is all. Forward motion, recorded and acknowledged, is enough to sustain the neurological state required to keep going. This finding demolishes one of the most dangerous assumptions people carry about mental toughness. The assumption is this: that you need big results to stay motivated. That progress only counts when it is visible, measurable, impressive. That if you cannot see dramatic change, you must not be doing enough. This belief is not just wrong. It is the exact mechanism that causes most people to quit. Because here is what actually happens when you set ambitious goals without understanding the progress principle. You commit to something meaningful. You start with energy. You work hard for a week, maybe 2. And then you look up and measure the gap between where you are and where you want to be. The gap is enormous. The distance feels impossible. And your brain, which has been scanning for evidence of progress and finding almost none that meets your inflated threshold, begins to generate the emotional signature of futility. Not all at once, not dramatically, quietly, a slow leak of belief, a gradual dimming of conviction, until one morning you wake up and the idea of continuing feels heavier than the idea of stopping. You did not lose motivation. You starved it. You set a standard for progress so high that your brain could not find enough evidence to justify continued effort. And in the absence of that evidence, the quitting reflex, the one you learned about in Chapter 1, filled the vacuum. The trained mind operates on a completely different accounting system. Instead of measuring progress against the final destination, the trained mind measures progress against yesterday, not against the ideal, not against someone else's timeline, against the last 24 hours. And within that compressed window, even the smallest action registers as a deposit. A single page read, a single email sent, a single minute of focused work on the task you have been avoiding. These are not trivial. These are the molecular units of momentum. And momentum, once it begins to accumulate, follows the same mathematical law that governs compound interest. Consider this. If you improve by just 1% each day, the math is not intuitive, but it is undeniable. 1% daily improvement, compounded over 1 year, does not produce a 365% gain. It produces a 3,700% gain. The curve is exponential, not linear. The early days feel flat, almost pointless. The first week of 1% gains looks identical to standing still. The first month barely registers. But somewhere around the third month, the curve begins to bend. And by the sixth month, the distance between where you started and where you stand becomes impossible to ignore. This is why most people quit at exactly the wrong time. They quit during the flat part of the curve, the part where daily effort appears to produce no visible result. They are standing on an exponential function and interpreting the early phase as proof that nothing is working. It is like planting a seed, watering it for 3 weeks, seeing nothing above the soil, and concluding that the seed is dead. Meanwhile, beneath the surface, an entire root system is expanding in every direction, building the infrastructure that will eventually support visible growth faster than you thought possible. But the compound curve only works if the inputs are consistent. And consistency requires a very specific psychological fuel, the fuel that the progress principle provides. Here is how to apply this in practice, and it requires a shift in what you track. Most people track outcomes: revenue, weight lost, pages written, followers gained. These are lagging indicators. They reflect the accumulated result of past effort, and they move slowly. When you anchor your sense of progress to lagging indicators, you are essentially asking your brain to stay motivated in the absence of feedback for weeks or months at a time. Very few brains can do this. Yours is not broken for struggling with it. It is human. What the trained mind tracks instead are leading indicators, the daily habits and micro-actions that produce the outcomes over time. Did you show up today? Did you execute the non-negotiable? Did you honor the commitment you made to yourself this morning? These are questions you can answer every 24 hours. And every time the answer is yes, your brain receives the micro-reward it needs to sustain effort. This is not about lowering your standards. It is about relocating your measurement. Your ambition stays exactly where it is. Your daily attention shifts to the smallest unit of progress that keeps the compound curve alive. Dr. B.J. Fogg at Stanford's Behavior Design Lab has spent over 20 years studying how habits form and sustain. His research produced a finding that most high achievers initially resist. The habits most likely to become permanent are the ones that feel almost embarrassingly small. Not because small habits produce small results, but because small habits remove the friction that causes abandonment. When a habit is tiny enough to require almost no willpower, it gets executed even on your worst days. And execution on your worst days is worth more than perfect performance on your best days, because it is the worst days that determine whether the chain of consistency survives or breaks. This is the architectural insight that transforms the progress principle from a theory into a daily operating system. You do not build an unbreakable mind by doing extraordinary things occasionally. You build it by doing small things without exception. Consider the math of consistency versus intensity. Person A works out intensely 3 days a week, averaging 45 minutes per session, but misses at least 1 week per month due to low energy, schedule conflicts, or lost motivation. Over a year, that is roughly 108 sessions. Person B does a modest 20-minute session every single day, no exceptions, regardless of mood or circumstances. Over a year, that is 365 sessions. Person B accumulates more than 3 times the total volume, and critically, never breaks the chain of identity reinforcement. Every single day, Person B's brain receives a vote confirming who they are. Person A's brain receives the same vote 3 times per week, interrupted regularly by gaps that whisper the opposite. The outcome difference over 12 months is not marginal. It is a fundamentally different human being. And this is where the progress principle connects directly to the identity framework from the previous chapter. Each micro-win is not just a task completed. It is an identity deposit. It is evidence, neurological, measurable, real, that you are the person you claim to be. An identity, as you now understand, is built not by declaration but by accumulation. The progress principle is the engine of that accumulation. It is the mechanism that converts daily habits into permanent self-concept. Without it, identity is just a story you tell yourself. With it, identity becomes a fact your brain can verify. Now here is the part most people do not expect. There is a force that actively works against the progress principle every single day. A force so normalized, so embedded in modern behavior, that you probably engage with it multiple times before noon without recognizing the damage it inflicts. It does not look like an enemy. It looks like sharing. It looks like excitement. It looks like connecting with the people around you. But neurologically, it is a saboteur, and it has a name. The next chapter reveals what it is, how it operates, and why the most resilient minds in the world have a strict protocol for neutralizing it before it ever takes hold. Chapter 5. The Silence Protocol. New York University neuroscientists discovered something disturbing in a series of experiments that should have received far more attention than it did. When you tell someone about a goal you intend to pursue, your brain releases a small but measurable dose of dopamine, the same neurochemical it releases when you actually accomplish something. In other words, the act of announcing your intention triggers a reward response almost identical to the reward of achieving it. Your brain cannot fully distinguish between talking about progress and making progress. And the consequences of this confusion are quietly devastating. Because here is what happens next. You tell a friend you are starting a business. You post about your new fitness commitment. You share your ambitious plan with a colleague over lunch. And in each of those moments, your brain collects a small dopamine payment. It feels good. It feels productive. It feels like you have already begun. But you have not begun. You have only spoken. And your brain, having already received a partial reward for the intention, now has significantly less neurochemical incentive to push through the discomfort of actual execution. Dr. Peter Gollwitzer at NYU published this research in the journal Psychological Science, and the findings were consistent across multiple experiments. Participants who announced their goals to others showed measurably reduced effort in pursuing those goals compared to participants who kept their intentions private. The public declaration created what Gollwitzer called a premature sense of completeness. The identity shift, "I am someone who is doing this," happened in the social moment of announcement rather than in the private moment of execution. And once the brain registered that shift, the urgency to prove it through action diminished. This is not a minor psychological quirk. This is a systematic hijacking of the exact mechanism you have been building across the last 3 chapters. Think about what you now understand. Chapter 1 showed you that quitting is a trained reflex. Chapter 2 gave you the snooze button test to begin rewiring that reflex through daily micro-commitments. Chapter 3 introduced identity over mood, the principle that your identity is built by accumulated actions, not by declarations. Chapter 4 revealed that microprogress, tracked daily, is the fuel that sustains the compound curve. Every one of these systems depends on one thing: the integrity of the feedback loop between action and reward. You do the work. Your brain registers the progress. Your identity strengthens. Momentum builds. Now consider what happens when you announce your goals publicly. You insert an artificial reward into the loop before any work has been done. The brain collects dopamine it did not earn. The identity registers a shift it did not build. And the entire system, the carefully constructed chain of habit, identity, and evidence, develops a fracture at its foundation. You feel like you are moving forward. Neurologically, you are standing still with a receipt for a purchase you never made. This is why some of the most disciplined people you will ever encounter share an unusual habit. They do not talk about what they are building. not because they are secretive by nature, not because they distrust the people around them, but because they understand, at an instinctive or learned level, that silence protects momentum in a way that conversation cannot. This is the silence protocol, and it operates on a principle that runs counter to almost everything modern culture encourages. We live in an environment engineered for disclosure. Social media rewards announcement. Professional culture celebrates public commitment. Friends and family expect to be included in your plans. The entire social architecture around you is designed to extract your intentions before they have had time to mature into actions. And every time you comply, every time you share the goal, post the update, accept the congratulations, you are making a withdrawal from a neurological account that should only be funded by execution. The University of Chicago's Booth School of Business conducted a longitudinal study on goal pursuit across 314 participants. They divided subjects into two groups. One group was instructed to share their goals with peers and receive social encouragement. The other group was instructed to keep their goals entirely private and report only to the researchers. After 6 months, the private group had a completion rate 43% higher than the public group. 43%. Same goals, same difficulty, same demographic. The only variable was whether or not other people knew. The researchers noted something particularly revealing in the follow-up interviews. The public group reported feeling supported and motivated in the early weeks. They enjoyed the social reinforcement. But that reinforcement created a dependency, a need for external validation that gradually replaced the internal feedback loop. When the social encouragement faded, as it inevitably does, their motivation faded with it. They had outsourced their drive to an audience, and the audience moved on. The private group reported something different. They described a quiet, almost stubborn sense of ownership over their process. Without external validation, the only evidence of their commitment was the work itself, and that forced them to develop an internal standard, a self-referencing habit of accountability that did not depend on anyone else's attention or approval. This is the deeper function of the silence protocol. It is not simply about avoiding dopamine leaks. It is about forcing your identity to be built exclusively from evidence you generate in private. When no one knows what you are working toward, you cannot borrow confidence from their belief in you. You cannot substitute their excitement for your own discipline. You are alone with your habits, your actions, and the honest, undecorated truth of whether you showed up today or not. And that aloneness, uncomfortable as it is where the most durable version of mental toughness is forged. Now, this does not mean you must never speak about your goals for the rest of your life. The silence protocol is not a vow of permanent secrecy. It is a strategic discipline applied during the most vulnerable phase of any commitment. The first 60 to 90 days, when the habit is still fragile, the identity is still forming, and the compound curve has not yet bent visibly upward. During this window, silence is not antisocial. It is protective. It is the difference between a seed that germinates in dark, undisturbed soil and one that gets pulled up every few days to check whether the roots are growing. The practical application is straightforward. When you begin a new commitment, tell no one. Post nothing. Accept no congratulations for intentions. Let the first evidence of your transformation be the transformation itself. Visible, undeniable, and earned entirely in silence. When people eventually notice the change, you will not need to explain what you did. The results will speak with an authority that no announcement could ever carry. There is one more piece to this system that needs to be addressed before you have the complete architecture. You now understand how to protect your momentum from internal sabotage. But there is an external force that every person who builds mental toughness must eventually face. A force that cannot be avoided, silenced, or engineered away. It arrives uninvited. It escalates without warning. And how you respond to it determines whether everything you have built holds or collapses. That force is pressure, and your relationship with it is about to be completely redefined. Chapter 6: The Pressure Principle. Here is a fact that will restructure how you understand stress forever. Navy SEALs do not perform well despite pressure. They perform well because of it. And the distinction between those two words, despite, and because contains the entire difference between a mind that breaks under load and a mind that becomes sharper, faster, and more precise the moment difficulty arrives. For decades, the dominant narrative about stress has been that it is a destructive force, something to be managed, reduced, avoided wherever possible. And the entire wellness industry has been built on this assumption. Meditation apps, stress reduction workshops, cortisol-lowering supplements, all designed around the premise that pressure is the enemy and your job is to minimize your exposure to it. That premise is incomplete. And building your mental toughness on an incomplete premise is like constructing a ship designed exclusively for calm water. It looks beautiful in the harbor. It performs flawlessly on a still lake. And the first time it encounters an actual ocean, it comes apart. Dr. Ali Akram at Stanford University's Mind and Body Lab conducted a series of landmark experiments that redefined the scientific understanding of stress. She divided participants into two groups and showed each group a different short film about stress before subjecting them to identical high-pressure tasks. One group watched a film framing stress as debilitating, harmful to health, destructive to performance, something to be minimized. The other group watched a film framing stress as enhancing, a signal that the body is mobilizing resources, sharpening focus, preparing for peak output. Same participants, same tasks, same objective pressure. The results were not subtle. The group that had been primed to view stress as enhancing showed significantly better cognitive performance, greater creative problem-solving capacity, and, remarkably, healthier cortisol profiles than the group primed to see stress as harmful. Their bodies were not just performing better. Their biochemistry was responding differently to the same external stimulus, based entirely on the mental frame they carried into the experience. This is not positive thinking. This is not telling yourself everything is fine when it is not. This is a measurable neurobiological shift that occurs when you change the interpretive habit your brain applies to pressure. And the word habit is precise here because your stress response is not fixed. It is a learned pattern, reinforced by years of experience, cultural messaging, and the stories you have been told about what pressure means. And like every learned pattern, it can be retrained. The United States military understood this principle long before the academic research confirmed it. The concept they use is called stress inoculation, a systematic process of exposing individuals to progressively increasing levels of controlled pressure so that their nervous system adapts, recalibrates, and eventually treats high-stress environments as operational normal. It is the same principle that governs how vaccines work. You do not build immunity by avoiding the pathogen. You build immunity by introducing it in measured doses until your system learns to respond without collapse. This is the pressure principle, and it operates on a truth that most people spend their entire lives running from. You do not become mentally tough by arranging a life with less pressure. You become mentally tough by systematically increasing your capacity to function inside it. Consider what this means for the way you have been approaching difficulty. Every time you avoided a hard conversation because the tension felt unbearable, you did not protect yourself. You reduced your capacity. Every time you stepped back from a high-stakes project because the pressure felt overwhelming, you did not preserve your energy. You trained your nervous system to treat that level of demand as beyond your range. And every time you chose the comfortable path over the challenging one, you cast a vote, using the identity framework from Chapter 3 for a version of yourself with a lower operational ceiling. The trained mind reverses this process entirely. It does not seek pressure for the sake of suffering. It seeks pressure the way an athlete seeks progressive overload in the weight room, as the specific stimulus required for adaptation. Without the load, there is no growth signal. Without the growth signal, capacity remains static. And a static capacity in a world that continuously escalates its demands is not stability. It is a slow, invisible decline. Now, the critical question becomes practical. How do you actually retrain your stress response without overwhelming your system? The answer comes from research conducted at the University of Rochester, published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology. The researchers found that the most effective method for rebuilding a person's relationship with pressure involved 3 components, applied consistently as daily habits. The first component is voluntary discomfort. This means deliberately introducing a small, controlled stressor into your day that you choose rather than one that is imposed on you. The cold final 30 seconds of a shower. The conversation you have been postponing. The task you have been avoiding because it sits just beyond your current comfort threshold. The key word is voluntary. When you choose the discomfort, your brain processes it fundamentally differently than when discomfort is forced upon you. Choice activates the prefrontal cortex. Force activates the amygdala. One builds capacity, the other builds fear. The second component is reappraisal in real time. This is the habit of intercepting your initial stress interpretation and consciously reframing it before it solidifies. When your heart rate increases before a presentation, the untrained response is, "I am anxious. Something is wrong." The trained response is, "My body is mobilizing. I am being prepared." This is not denial. The physiological sensations are identical. The interpretation is what changes. And Dr. Crumb's research showed that this single cognitive habit, practiced consistently, produced measurable changes in both performance and long-term health outcomes within as little as 3 weeks. The third component is post-pressure reflection. After a high-stress event, the untrained mind either collapses into relief or immediately distracts itself to avoid replaying the discomfort. The trained mind does something different. It reviews, not with judgment, not with self-criticism, but with the clinical curiosity of an engineer examining a system under load. What held? What buckled? What would I adjust next time? This habit transforms every pressure event from a threat to be survived into data to be integrated. And over time, the accumulation of that data produces something no amount of avoidance ever could: genuine, earned confidence that you can handle what comes next. These 3 habits, voluntary discomfort, real-time reappraisal, and post-pressure reflection, form the operating system of the pressure principle. They are not dramatic. They are not heroic. They are small, daily, repeatable practices that compound over weeks and months into a fundamentally different nervous system. A system that does not flinch when the stakes rise. Not because it feels no fear, but because it has been trained through consistent exposure and deliberate habit to convert that fear into fuel. And this brings you to an important threshold in this book. You now possess 5 frameworks. The snooze button test for daily self-trust. Identity over mood for anchoring behavior to self-concept. The progress principle for sustaining momentum through micro-evidence. The silence protocol for protecting that momentum from premature reward. And now, the pressure principle for expanding your capacity under load. Together, these form a powerful system. But there is a vulnerability that none of them address. A blind spot so fundamental that it can dismantle every framework you have built, not through external failure, but through internal deception. The most dangerous opponent you will ever face in the pursuit of mental toughness is not pressure, not fatigue, not even the quitting reflex. It is the lies you tell yourself about how you are actually doing. The next chapter confronts that opponent directly, and it does not do so gently. Chapter 7: The Mirror Test. The most dangerous lie is never the one someone else tells you. It is the one you tell yourself while believing you are being honest. And Stanford psychologists have spent decades proving that this particular form of deception costs more than most people will ever calculate. Dr. Carol Tavries and Dr. Elliot Aronson, in their landmark research on cognitive dissonance, documented a pattern so universal that it operates across every culture, every profession, and every level of intelligence. When a person's actions contradict their self-image, the brain does not simply record the contradiction and move on. It actively rewrites the narrative to eliminate the discomfort, not by changing the behavior, by changing the story about the behavior. The workout you skipped becomes, "I needed rest." The commitment you broke becomes, "The timing wasn't right." The goal you abandoned becomes, "I realized it wasn't what I really wanted." Each revision feels reasonable in the moment. Each one protects the ego from the sharp edge of truth. and each one erodes the foundation of every system you have been building throughout this book. Because here is what self-deception actually attacks. It does not attack your goals. It attacks your ability to see yourself accurately. And accurate self-perception is the prerequisite for every framework you now possess. The snooze button test requires you to honestly acknowledge whether you kept your morning commitment. Identity over mood requires you to truthfully assess whether you are acting from identity or from feeling. The progress principle requires you to genuinely track whether you moved forward or stood still. The silence protocol requires you to admit whether you are protecting momentum or seeking validation. The pressure principle requires you to honestly evaluate whether you are expanding your capacity or retreating from discomfort. Every single one of these systems breaks the moment you start lying to yourself about how you are performing inside them. And the research tells us that you are almost certainly lying more often than you realize. A 2015 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences examined the frequency of self-deception in daily decision-making. The researchers found that the average person engages in measurable self-deceptive reasoning approximately 5 to 7 times per day. Not occasionally, not under extreme stress, daily, as a matter of neurological routine. The brain does it automatically, seamlessly, without announcing itself. You do not experience self-deception as lying. You experience it as reasoning. This is what makes it the most formidable obstacle to mental toughness. It wears the disguise of logic. The mirror test is designed to strip that disguise away. It is not a metaphor. It is a daily practice, a structured habit of radical self-assessment that forces your brain to confront the unedited truth of your actions, measured against the identity you claim to be building. Here's how it works. At the end of each day, you ask yourself 3 questions, not in passing, not while scrolling your phone, in a deliberate, undistracted moment of stillness, even if that moment lasts only 90 seconds. Question 1. Did I honor my commitments to myself today, or did I renegotiate them when they became uncomfortable? This question targets the snooze button pattern, the tendency to revise promises to yourself downward the moment resistance appears. The answer must be factual, not mostly or kind of. Yes or no. Question 2. When I chose not to act, was the reason legitimate, or was it a story I constructed to avoid discomfort? This question targets cognitive dissonance directly. It asks you to examine your own justifications with the same skepticism you would apply to someone else's excuses. Most people are remarkably skilled at detecting rationalization in others and remarkably blind to it in themselves. This question deliberately reverses that asymmetry. Question 3. If someone I deeply respected had observed my entire day in complete detail, would I feel proud of what they saw? Or would I hope certain hours went unnoticed? This question bypasses the ego entirely. It shifts the evaluation from internal narrative to external observation. It introduces an imagined witness, not to create shame, but to access a level of honesty that private self-assessment often cannot reach on its own. These 3 questions, asked consistently, create something that no motivational speech or productivity system can replicate. They create a habit of undistorted self-knowledge. And undistorted self-knowledge is the rarest and most valuable asset a person can possess in the pursuit of mental toughness. Because consider what happens without it. A person can practice every framework in this book and still fail, not because the frameworks are inadequate, but because the data they are operating on is corrupted. They believe they are keeping promises they are actually breaking. They believe they are building identity when they are actually maintaining an illusion. They believe they are progressing when they are actually cycling through the same patterns with different labels. Self-deception does not stop you from running the system. It stops you from knowing whether the system is actually working. The mirror test eliminates that blind spot. Not comfortably, not pleasantly. It is the least enjoyable habit in this entire book, but it is the one that holds every other habit accountable. Dr. Tasha Eurich, an organizational psychologist whose research on self-awareness spanned nearly 5,000 participants across multiple studies, found that only 10 to 15% of people meet the criteria for genuine self-awareness. Not self-esteem, not self-confidence, self-awareness. the ability to see yourself as you actually are, not as you prefer to believe you are. Her research also found that the single most reliable predictor of whether a person would develop self-awareness was not intelligence or education. It was whether they had a consistent practice of structured self-reflection, a habit, a recurring, non-negotiable encounter with their own honest assessment. That is the mirror test, not a moment of inspiration, not a weekend retreat, a daily habit of confronting the gap between the person you performed as today and the person you are building yourself to become. And when that habit is in place, when you can no longer hide from your own data, something remarkable begins to happen. The other frameworks accelerate. Progress becomes real instead of imagined. Identity solidifies around actual evidence instead of comfortable fiction. Pressure becomes diagnostic instead of destabilizing. And the momentum you build is no longer fragile because it is not built on a story. It is built on truth. You now have 6 frameworks, 6 internal systems, each addressing a different dimension of the quitting reflex. But frameworks without integration are just a collection of ideas. And the difference between someone who knows 6 powerful principles and someone who lives them is not knowledge. It is architecture. The daily structure that makes each principle automatic, sequential, and self-reinforcing. And that architecture, the engineering that binds everything together into a single operating system, is exactly what the next chapter constructs. Chapter 8, The Habit Architecture. MIT's Habit Research Lab discovered that 43% of your daily actions are not decisions at all. They are automated sequences, neurological scripts that your brain executes without consulting your conscious mind. You do not decide to reach for your phone when you wake up. You do not decide to take the same route to work. You do not decide to open the refrigerator when you feel stressed at 9 in the evening. These are not choices. They are programs, and they are running whether you design them or not. This is the fact that separates people who understand mental toughness from people who actually live it. Understanding is intellectual. Living is architectural. And architecture means building a daily structure where the right actions happen not because you remembered them, not because you felt motivated, not because you summoned willpower at the critical moment, but because the environment, the sequence, and the neurological cues have been arranged so precisely that the behavior occurs with the same effortless automaticity as brushing your teeth. Over the previous 7 chapters, you have acquired 6 frameworks. Each one addresses a specific failure point in the quitting reflex. The snooze button test builds morning self-trust. Identity over mood anchors behavior to self-concept instead of emotion. The progress principle sustains momentum through daily microevidence. The silence protocol protects that momentum from premature neurological reward. The pressure principle expands your operational capacity under load. The mirror test ensures honest self-assessment, so every other framework runs on accurate data. Individually, each framework is powerful. Collectively, without a binding structure, they are 6 tools scattered across a workbench, available in theory but absent when the moment demands them. The habit architecture is the system that organizes them into a single, sequential, self-reinforcing daily operating system. And the science behind it is more precise than most people expect. Dr. Wendy Wood at the University of Southern California has spent over 30 years studying how habits form, persist, and become resistant to disruption. Her research, published across multiple journals, including Psychological Review, produced a finding that contradicts one of the most popular assumptions in personal development. Most people believe that building a new habit requires motivation and repetition. Dr. Wood's data showed that the single most powerful predictor of habit formation was neither. It was context, the environmental and sequential cues that trigger the behavior. Change the context, and you change the behavior. Leave the context unchanged, and no amount of intention will override what the environment is silently instructing your brain to do. This is why most people fail to sustain the habits they know they should build. They attempt to install new behaviors into old environments. They try to meditate in the same room where they scroll social media. They try to write in the same space where they watch television. They try to execute a morning protocol while their phone sits on the nightstand, loaded with notifications, glowing with the promise of effortless stimulation. And then they wonder why discipline feels so exhausting. Discipline feels exhausting when you are fighting your environment. It feels nearly effortless when your environment is fighting for you. The first principle of the habit architecture is environment design. Before you attempt to install any new daily behavior, you restructure the physical and digital space around you so that the desired action becomes the path of least resistance and the undesired action becomes the path of greatest friction. This is not about willpower. This is about engineering. The phone charges in another room. The workout clothes are laid out the night before. The journal sits open on the desk where you will see it the moment you sit down. Each of these arrangements is a small architectural decision that removes one micro-negotiation from your morning. And micro-negotiations, accumulated across a day, are the silent tax that depletes the very resource you need to sustain your frameworks. The second principle is habit stacking, a technique validated by researchers at the University College London Habit Lab, where Dr. Philippa Lally's team studied how long it actually takes to form automatic behaviors. The popular claim is 21 days. Lally's data showed the median was 66 days, with significant variation depending on the complexity of the behavior. But the behaviors that formed fastest and held longest shared one structural characteristic. They were attached to an existing automatic behavior. You do not build a new habit in isolation. You attach it to something your brain already does without thinking. Here is what that looks like in practice, applied to the 6 frameworks of this book. Your alarm sounds. That is the cue. Your feet hit the floor, the snooze button test. That is the first link in the chain. You stand, and because your workout clothes are already laid out, you put them on. That is environment design removing the negotiation. During or after your physical movement, you execute your one non-negotiable micro-task for the day, the progress principle. It is small. It takes minutes, but it is done before the world has had a chance to impose its agenda on yours. Throughout the day, when pressure arrives, you apply the reappraisal habit from the pressure principle, not as an emergency intervention, but as a trained, automatic interpretive response. You protect your commitments and your goals through the silence protocol, allowing execution to accumulate without the leakage of premature announcement. And at the end of the day, in a brief, undistracted moment, you run the mirror test. 3 questions, 90 seconds, honest answers. Each habit triggers the next. Each one is anchored to a contextual cue that your brain already recognizes. And each successful repetition casts another vote for the identity you are constructing. The chain is not held together by motivation. It is held together by sequence, by the neurological momentum that one completed action generates for the next. This is the architecture, and its most important property is not what it contains, but what it eliminates. It eliminates the daily negotiation about whether you will do the work. It eliminates the moment of uncertainty where the quitting reflex finds its opening. It eliminates the gap between intention and action where most people's systems collapse. When the habit architecture is installed and running, the question is no longer, will I do this today? The question has been retired. The behavior simply occurs because the cues are in place, the sequence is loaded, and the identity behind it has been confirmed so many times that deviation would feel like a disruption rather than a relief. Dr. Wood's research noted one final detail that deserves attention. The habits that proved most resilient against disruption, the ones that survived vacations, illness, career changes, and emotional crises, were not the most complex. They were the most consistent. Simplicity, executed without exception, outlasted sophistication executed intermittently every single time. So keep the architecture simple, keep it sequential, and keep it non-negotiable. You now have the complete system. 6 frameworks, bound by a daily architecture designed to make each one automatic. But there is one dimension of this system that no architecture can automate and no habit can fully protect. It is the dimension that reveals, more than any other measure, whether the identity you have been building is real or performative. It is what you do when absolutely no one is watching. And that question deserves its own chapter. Chapter 9, the final test. Picture yourself 1 year from now. It is a Tuesday. Nothing special about it. No deadline. No audience. No accountability partner checking in. No one will know whether you did the work today or whether you spent the afternoon drifting between distractions. Just you, the hours, and the silent question of what you choose to do with them. That question, answered honestly, on an ordinary day, with no external consequence either way, reveals more about who you actually are than any public performance ever could. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Personality measured behavioral consistency across over 800 participants in public and private contexts. On average, participants exerted 28% less effort when they were entirely alone compared to when they knew they were being observed. 28%. Their behavior changed not because the task changed, but because the audience disappeared. And this reveals a truth most people would prefer not to examine. Much of what they call discipline is actually performance. If your consistency drops when no one is watching, then the identity you have been building is partially dependent on the gaze of others. It is not fully yours. And an identity that requires an audience will fail you precisely when you need it most, in the long, quiet stretches where the real work of mental toughness takes place. The trained mind understands something the performing mind does not. Private discipline is the only discipline that compounds without interruption. When you execute your habits in public, the reward splits between internal identity reinforcement and external social validation. When you execute those same habits alone, the full neurological reward is directed inward. Every private repetition is a pure deposit into self-trust. No dilution, no dependency, no fragility. The University of Pennsylvania's Positive Psychology Center, led by Dr. Martin Seligman, published longitudinal research confirming that individuals who maintained identical habits and standards regardless of external observation scored significantly higher on every measure of resilience and sustained achievement over a 5-year period. The researchers called it self-concordance, a state where external actions and internal identity exist in complete alignment, independent of context. Self-concordance is not a personality trait. It is a product of accumulated private decisions. Each time you honor your commitment when no one would know the difference, you deepen the alignment. Each time you let it slide, you widen the gap. And over years, it is the width of that gap that determines whether your mental toughness holds under the weight of a real life or fractures the moment the structure is tested. So the test is this: not the Monday after you listen to this audiobook, when the ideas are fresh. Not the Friday before a deadline, when urgency provides its own fuel. The Tuesday 3 months from now, when the novelty has faded and the only thing sustaining the system is the depth of the identity underneath it. On that Tuesday, who do you become? You now possess every framework this book was designed to deliver. The snooze button test for daily self-trust. Identity over mood for anchoring behavior to self-concept. The progress principle for sustaining momentum through microevidence. The silence protocol for protecting that momentum from premature reward. The pressure principle for expanding your capacity under load. The mirror test for keeping every framework running on honest data. And the habit architecture that binds them into a single daily operating system. You know all of this. And that knowledge places you at a threshold most people never reach. Not because the information is unavailable, but because most people consume it without converting it into action. They listen, they agree, they feel the resonance. And then they return to the same habits, the same defaults, and wonder why understanding was not enough. Understanding is never enough. It is the foundation, not the structure. The structure is built by doing. By one morning where your feet hit the floor before the negotiation begins. By one day where you track the micro win instead of measuring the gap. By one week where you protect your momentum in silence. By one month where the daily sequence runs without interruption. Not perfectly, not heroically, but consistently. And that is the decision. Not a decision to transform your life in a single dramatic moment. The real decision is smaller, quieter, and infinitely more powerful. It is the decision to execute the system once, tomorrow morning, with the calm, unremarkable precision of someone who has already decided who they are. Because here is the truth beneath everything you have learned. You do not become mentally unbreakable by achieving something extraordinary. You become mentally unbreakable by refusing to abandon the ordinary habits that build you, day after day, in silence, under pressure, without applause, without exception. Tomorrow morning, when the alarm sounds, put your feet on the floor. Do not negotiate. Do not consult your mood. Just move. And in that 7-second act, cast the first vote for the person you are building. Then do it again the next day, and the next, and let the compound effect of kept promises do what no single moment of motivation ever could. This is not where this book ends. This is where it begins.